Okay, hello everyone, and welcome again on ArchiDiaries with yet another interesting and insightful live interview. This time we are doing our regular interview under the series called Reflections. Reflections is a more sustained activity that we do at ArchiDiaries. So, in terms of live interviews, we do on one hand a series of interviews based around a theme. Whereas the reflections, we try to invite eminent guests and personalities from across the fields of architecture and design to get diverse kinds of conversations going on this platform. So I'm really glad to share that today we are going to talk to a very dear friend, an architect from Ahmedabad, architect Riyaz Tayyibji from principal at Anthill Design, Ahmedabad. Riyaz, welcome at ArchiDiaries, and it's really good to see you here.
Thanks, Ayaz. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Riyaz. It's good to have you. And partner at Anthill Design, Ahmedabad. He is actively involved in architectural documentation, research, and academics. He has been an associate professor at the Faculty of Architecture, CEPT University, and the coordinator of the Gandhi Heritage Sites Mission, set up to document the buildings made by and related to the life of M.K. Gandhi. He has curated exhibitions on the architecture and urbanity of Ahmedabad. Presently, he is a team lead at NIUA, which stands for National Institute of Urban Affairs, working on a heritage conservation plan for the World Heritage City Ahmedabad following its UNESCO inscription. Let me please introduce our panelist, Siddharth Singh. Siddharth Singh is a founding partner of Design Pendulum. In the past, he has worked on many large-scale projects like urban revitalization of Tajganj and developing a heritage hotel called House of CG Ahmedabad. He has collaborated with Bentham Crowell, Amsterdam, and the Berlin studios of David Chipperfield Architects and Topotech One, and many more. Siddharth Singh is currently engaged with diverse mediums such as practicing as a graphic designer, theater, text, and is also currently teaching at many architecture and design institute, few to mention such as CEPT University Ahmedabad. So I would the title of the presentation that Riyaz has chosen today is and also the topic is very interesting, and I'm really looking forward to his presentation and also the conversation. The title goes like this: towards a bits and pieces, Tukde Tukde practice. So I'll invite Prutha to read over the description, which I think is a very interesting description, and it's very important that we should read out for our viewers. Prutha, can you please read out the text for us?
Yes, yes. Specialization is often considered an organizational, financial, and creative strength. But what does one do if one has a broad spectrum of interests and aspires to engage and develop them all? In this presentation, Riyaz Tayyibji describes the evolution of a practice that has varied interests from building design, documentation, architectural research, restoration, publication, theoretical, speculation, exhibition curation, some sort of advocacy, and more recently, policy formulation. In short, Riyaz will share the joys of being a jack of all trades and questioning the need for the master of one. I request Riyaz sir to share his presentation with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Ayaz and everybody at ArchiDiaries. Um, one of the problems of presenting amongst friends is that they've known you for so long, you're doing anybody. Like pehle fatte se pata chal jata hai. So, I mean, that's just the background to this. But really, sorry, just one second. Let me get this started. Yeah, really, what I what I wanted to talk about today, and the opportunity that ArchiDiaries has kind of presented, is the kind of meandering process by which we have gone about our practice, and it has been purely based on the opportunities that have opened up from the work that one has done. And it's my kind of understanding that as you do work, it kind of opens up certain opportunities. Often our kind of how would you say, our professional makeup and assumptions determine whether we take those opportunities, whether we even recognize them, and or whether we move forward, or whether we dismiss them as sideshows that could have been done, but perhaps are not part of the larger, kind of professional requirements. Often you hear architects, but also in other fields, you hear people saying, but this is what is required for the real world. We'll keep that aside for the moment, and I'll just say that one of the problems and the wonderful opportunities that we have faced is that we have loved drawing. And this has been part and parcel of the education that we received when we were students. But it wasn't only that, because it was also a kind of theoretical understanding that what differentiates the artist and the architect from, but actually not the artist, but what differentiates the architect from the craftsman and the master craftsman is literacy. And that literacy within the architectural world is determined by drawing. And of course, we can go back into the historical context in which this emerged. When Brunelleschi would go to site every day, and he was in that sense the last master craftsman. But Alberti was the one who set down the kind of precedents for drawing in the office as separate from the site. And I mean, whether one likes it or not, one was inculcated in that tradition of architecture. And therefore, what I'm going to show you initially is this full kind of this excuse of drawing, taking every excuse that we could find because we enjoyed it. And of course, there was the academic part of it during college and school days at CEPT, where you drew for your project and you drew in order to understand design, but you also drew in order to measure and to record and to understand in a kind of research way. And that came through, let's say, this related study program or whatever other measure drawing subjects and projects you were dealing with. And research opened up ways of getting intimate with the context that one was in. And though one was drawing, that drawing was always kind of relating back to a reality. It was an abstract mode that allowed you to inquire about the reality that was around you or that you were studying, but it was always related to that reality. So the idea of drawing for drawing's sake was something that was not necessarily part of the makeup which we were working. And so here you can see that there's a drawing, there's a photograph. One is trying to abstract out certain relationships, the continuity of the horizontal plane, perhaps, of an area to understand the way that the architecture of it in the, mahal of cloth and people and sweat and all that materiality that makes up the bazaar. In India, you're trying to still find what is the kind of architectural baseline that is there. There were other people around me, Roma, who I started to practice with, and Sarosh and Keo. They were also drawing, and Roma was doing this incredible study for her undergraduate that was looking at the relationship or the possible relationships in space making between the Kailashnath in Ellora and the Mill Association building in Ahmedabad, and this opened up a certain kind of dialogue. But that dialogue happened through drawing, and it gave us ways about thinking about space that we wanted to be able to talk about, or at least able to record, recognize. This, of course, is the pole house, the court of a pole house in Ahmedabad. One was trying to look at the spatiality that comes from even, let's say, a forest, and the way that light comes through from above, vertical light versus horizontal light, and you're trying to record these things, and you're trying to say that what would be the spatiality that comes from an arboreal forest kind of landscape versus that comes from, let's say, a cave kind of landscape. And you could say that in some sense the kind of dialogue that we were having was, what is the relationship between weight and density, one which is pull towards the earth, and the other which has movement, but also has a certain sense of gathering material. So I mean, these were so as the one is drawing in a kind of realistic manner, underlying it through the drawing are these questions which are architectural and have to do with the qualitative aspects of space. In no way is the idea of drawing only related to one's work. One is drawing also the intimacy of one's personal spaces and the people who are surrounding us in that kind of milieu. And the act of drawing and it was only after a certain amount of time that you realize that this act of drawing is actually a way of becoming intimate with things, with people, with the context one is in. And it is not necessarily that I'm advocating that this is a tool for everybody. I'm only putting out there that this is the tool that we use as a team of people who are starting practice. And this is I mean, a completely different type of language of drawing, but this is Saroj's drawing. And in many ways, his preoccupations were similar, but of a extremely different, language of the way line and plane and color and all of that comes together. So I mean, when you are kind of in this mode, often your practice is asking questions as to how do we make this sustainable, particularly in those early years where you're kind of looking at opportunities for developing modes of working, and you know that this is something that you think is important. But you're also kind of saying that, yeah, it takes time, and it takes you have to take that time out of the work that you're doing, which is normally considered the practice, and take it forward from there. And we were lucky that a lot of our initial projects were outside Ahmedabad, and that already gave us time to and opportunities to travel and so on. So we would kind of make excuses of office trips when actually one was going to site and kind of visit other places, as part of this whole excuse for drawing. So we had our office trips which were about drawing, and a lot of them didn't lead anywhere, in the sense they didn't kind of they were not purposeful in that they weren't meant to be towards a particular project. They were simply ways of recording things that were of interest to us. So that's the other part of it, that there's a lot of redundancy in all of it. There's a lot of work. It's not even work. It's because you're doing it because it's what you do. But that it's not aimed towards having purpose, and you're doing it because it interests you. And and you're using the opportunities that come your way, whether it's an RSP. This was an RSP with the care school in Trichy, and it's a sketch that I made of the Rockford Temple, of how those incredible cascading connections through the rock actually reach the temple. And it's just something that it wasn't meant to be a project, but it's the way that you want to develop your understanding of that material relationships, etc. You've basically taken the opportunity of an RSP to get the time to do this kind of drawing. There's, of course, you're taking that drawing back, and a different mode of drawing back into the practice where you're developing details and design and so on. So that drawing starts affecting the way that you kind of work. Okay, and but the point I'm making in this first part of my story about drawing is that really it is what is driving the practice, and you're looking for opportunities to do bits and pieces of things with it over a larger period of time. And it was sometime in 2008 that, strangely, and I'm not quite sure how it happened, but 3 opportunities simultaneously between 2008 and 2010, early 2010, in a span of about a year and a half, opportunities came our way that allowed us to take this into a kind of formal domain. And there were 2 exhibitions and an opportunity to do a research essay. The first one was actually in the architectural institute called Archem in Amsterdam, where we were given a very small amount of money, but an interesting brief to look at the city of Ahmedabad post-liberalization. And this was about 2008. And we were asked that in the decade or so since liberalization, what are the new typologies of architecture that have emerged in your city, and they were looking at 6 cities across India, and we were looking at Ahmedabad. And it was interesting because we were one of the few architects who were looking at architectural phenomenon rather than architectural buildings. So phenomenon, we mapped the whole of SG highway, as to how this incredible new kind of urbanity was kind of emerging. And one of the nice drawings which I couldn't put up, and it actually makes no sense looking at it on a PowerPoint, is looking at the 10-kilometer scale of SG highway, the previous bazaar, which is CG Road, which is about 2 kilometers long, and then Dhalgarwad, which I had also studied, which was the earlier market. And you look at the scalar differences when you put the three together, and we have this beautiful drawing where you can actually not see Dhalgarwad when you look at it in the scale of SG highway. And those were the kind of mappings we were saying, and already recognizing that scale had changed because of liberalization. What financial capital could do in terms of just development was already in the early 2000s. This was not early 2000, but 2008, 2009, was recognized in what was then called a second-tier city of Ahmedabad. So already the signs were visible, and of course we were showing building typologies like AMA, which was kind of public building, a building, an institutional building which was not on a campus. The whole of Ahmedabad's history is dotted with campuses, and very well-known campuses and beautiful campuses. But AMA was the first institutional building which sat on the street and made a positive response to the city in that sense. And that was a very important building in that sense. One might have many things to say about the architecture, but one can't actually, one must recognize the urban gesture, both in its institutional structure as well as in the way that it's positioned on the street. That was important. There were other things that we studied. We were given a brief to study 8 to 10 buildings, and by then the riverfront and Gift City were all on the horizon. So Ahmedabad was changing in an interesting way. Simultaneously, though this was a future-looking and very, in that sense, very Dutch brief that was given to us, another brief was given to us by the municipal corporation, which was to put together a heritage, a document and exhibition about the city of Ahmedabad. That's the one that actually has developed over the years, and in some sense, we've been adding to that body of knowledge that we put together in those 5 or 6 months that we worked on curating that exhibition, and took the interest and the documentation and the drawing of Ahmedabad further. But one of the more important drawings we made was of the entire geography of North Gujarat, and placed the typology of settlement of Ahmedabad in the larger cultural geography.
Yes, sorry to disturb you. Are you presenting? The slides?
Yes, I am.
Slides aren't moving.
No, my slide has been still for a while.
Sorry.
I haven't. No, not at all. There will be speed differentials. Sometimes slow, sometimes fast. Okay. So should I continue?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So no, my point is only that these were kind of interesting opportunities to draw and research, and not necessarily be only locked in the idea of architectural production as of buildings. The third documentation, which came quite by chance, was that Aniket Bhagwat and Samira Rathod, both well-known architects, had decided to start the Spade publication. And for that, out of the blue, they asked me to do a piece on Gandhi, and particularly the Sabarmati Ashram. And as I will show you, the kind of research that we did for that has led to almost a decade of looking at Gandhi, and in that sense, looking at modernity in India in a kind of in another way from the way that one started, or one was introduced to it academically. So, sorry, just one second. Yeah. So, and interestingly, there are cross references between those exhibitions that we can talk about perhaps when we are discussing. But really, when we took up, and I'm not going to get too much more into the exhibitions, but it's really to talk about how taking up a very small maybe 5,000 word essay led to a decade of work. So the Tukda, as I have put in the title, that little bit taking it really seriously and then kind of developing it. And initially, our observations came from actually 2 or 3 dirty sketches that you're seeing here. And that was really that there's a difference between Korea's building and Gandhi Ashram. That is the Hriday Kunj. And there's a significant spatial difference in the way that when one is in that space, there's a continuity between the outside and the inside in the older buildings, and somehow in Korea's buildings, there's a much starker edge, and even the way the shadow falls is a line that is so sharp that it makes a distinction between one domain, as in light and in shadow, whereas there's a much more speckled, kind of broken filigree of shadow that is there in the older buildings. And we started with this, and my point is that to recognize this required the drawing of a certain type. And I have to point out here that these drawings are not made by me. The sketch in the charcoal sketch is, but you will find that as I go through these sketches, they're made by different people in office. And so it's really a cumulative drawing exercise that's going on, and there's discussion about it within the office that's leading to observations and realizations on the way. So here the drawing on the left is made by Khushbu Shah, and then there's the starkness of the modern buildings with the concrete edge. And it's interesting because all Korea does is put the gutter in concrete. Otherwise, the sloping roof and the brick walls are pretty much similar in their technology. But the way that the gutter cast allows you to make a sharp edge between the building and the outside is what makes that distinction. Of course, there are a large number of drawings that come in that excuse is to really understand also the construction and the manner that these buildings are made, and further research, which was actually a decade later, closer to 2016, 17, that studies and material became available about this incredible man by the name of Herman Kallenbach. Herman Kallenbach was a South African architect who was Gandhi's closest friend. And in South Africa, actually taught Gandhi how to build and taught Gandhi how to work with various kinds of material. Kallenbach himself was this incredible guy who studied at the Stuttgart Institute, was an extremely fine carpenter himself, taught Gandhi how to work with wood, etc., etc. And you can see in the way that the trusses on that veranda are made that there's this kind of transfer of knowledge between Kallenbach and Gandhi, and there's much more that goes on, as one gets into the research of this, and it led to our research then of the Varda ashrams. Interestingly, I had no prior relationship with Gandhi's architecture, except that we had, again, quite serendipitously won a competition in Varda that started our practice. And that's what led me to see this building for the first time. And I remember the shock of seeing Bapu Kutir in Varda, that we hadn't studied it as part of the most important buildings of modern India. And I don't think that you can understand one entire trajectory of Indian modernism unless you've seen this building, which is, of course, Laurie Baker, the Kamats, etc., etc., and the whole kind of DD contractor and that kind of modernity that came to India, which is a reinterpretation of, let's say, more traditional ways of thinking. And yet, as I've demonstrated in a paper recently, these are extremely modern buildings, and we are fooled by their materiality to think that they are, the same as the old traditional buildings that you see. And so you have to look at then Gandhi's idea of the ashram as a modern construct. And this is not an ashram of antiquity that you read about in the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. This is a modern interpretation. And one should be asking, how is it modern? Rather than, just saying, oh, old, if you're building in, mud and tile, then it must be kind of traditional. As a lot of research is showing, and I think Arijit Chatterjee and Asha Sumra have done this incredible research on the Mangalore tile and how it's a completely international kind of global knowledge system that led to the Mangalore tile. And I won't go into that in detail, but these are the things that are happening simultaneously while we are drawing. And we are thinking about Gandhi, but we are also thinking like, it's really strange when you actually study Gandhi. There are 5 or 6 tropes of modernity which are there in his work, as evidently as they are in Corbusier's. There is a Villa Savoy and Villa Gash on the left hand side of your screen. And what we started noticing is that Gandhi talks about the sky, Corbusier talks about the sky, Gandhi talks about the ground, Corbusier talks about the ground, Gandhi talks about the envelope, Corbusier talks about the. If you take the 5 principles, you can look at an equivalent 5 principles of a Gandhian architecture. But the point is that there's relationships there, and this kind of really weird thinking led us to actually investigate what are the kind of relationships. And you find that these two guys are actually quite similar in the way that they are constructed. And the drawing on your right is an axonometric that we made in the office of Corbusier's cabin, on where he spent the last 15 years of his life, and compare this with Gandhi's study in Varda, and you will get a sense of the intimacy and the scales that they were talking about. Corbusier's is 3.6 by 3.6 by 3.6 cube, and Gandhi's has got a kind of intimacy of its own that comes from, specifying to that not more than 500 rupees should be spent on the building. And interestingly, Bapu Kutir was not actually built by Gandhi for himself. It was built by Madeline Slade, Mirabai, for herself. And Gandhi was moved to that building, and he liked it very much. So there are all kinds of gender issues in that as well that one can open up when one is talking about it. But that comes only when you start drawing it and you start recognizing these kind of patterns. What I want to share with you is this kind of I don't know, I would call it a kind of culture or a kind of tradition that we've kind of looked at over time. These are drawings made for the Stepwell exhibition, which went forward from the Ahmedabad exhibition, which looked at the cultural geography of North Gujarat. And these drawings are made by another bunch of students who joined voluntarily to work on the Stepwell exhibition. In fact, it was their enthusiasm that pushed that to the level and to the formal putting together of an exhibition that it finally reached. So Priyanka, Ashini, Tanvi are all the people who have made this, but it started from the understanding that the Stepwell amongst architects is looked at as an individual building, but as we started kind of tracing them, we found 17 at that time, but now they're closer to 25 in Ahmedabad, and that's an incredible number of Stepwells. And the sections and plans on the right-hand side show you the kind of scale from the one in Doshina Varani pole at the bottom, which belongs to an individual temple, right to the ones that we know at the top, which are the public institutional ones. So there's a whole range of scales that is there, but it's dotted around the entire kind of landscape of Ahmedabad. And that led us to believe that this is a system and this is not individual buildings, and that there's a correlationship between groundwater, surface water, settlement, and topography. And of course, then in the process of studying, it led to gender issues and issues of deities and cultural underpinnings that accompany these things. But my point the point I wanted to make was that this became a kind of a recurrent thing, that at any given point we were doing a certain amount of drawing and research in the office that was driving the thinking and understanding of the context in which we were, that is Ahmedabad. These are some of the drawings that were made of these stepwells. So you can see the stepwell locked in really, really tiny spaces between the temple and the house. In this case, this is Doshiwadani pole. And of course, we looked at every kind of exhibition opportunity is also a way of inserting an installation into an existing space. This is what you see on your left side is the frame that we made that was meant to simulate the stepwell spaces. And it was made in steel and it carried everything, but it allowed you to traverse Kanoria, which is where the exhibition was, and occupy it in ways that you couldn't otherwise. We took every opportunity to kind of take occupy various buildings. This is Milona's association, and just with construction scaffolding, we did this exhibition of Manisha Shodhan Basu's work. And whether there are relationships between this and the earlier exhibitions, I'm not sure. Opportunities presented themselves and we took it. And redrew her entire oeuvre, made models and so on and so forth, and then looked at this opportunity of inserting these grids into Corbusier's space, which was as much fun as the curation of the exhibition. There have been opportunities to draw, and I won't get into all of them, but this is the Death of Architecture exhibition, for which it was a much more theoretical, abstract position that we were exploring vis-a-vis the notions of time and architecture. And what we were really getting at in that exhibition was that somehow the multiplicities of time had disappeared from architectural thinking, and what was valorized is the now. That you're only the now, and the future to some degree is being valorized, and that the kind of different kind of notions of time, from geographical to historical to what have you, are being lost in the way that we are thinking about that space. So I mean, what I'm saying is those first few exercises of drawing and just continuously keeping at it led to publications, led to articles in various journals, etc., etc. So those little bits and pieces, things kind of accumulate, and they become more and more significant as you go on. And that significance is really only because you present it to a public. If you ask me, I'm still thinking in those bits and pieces that make up various parts of what we are interested in. But from time to time, you kind of put it together and you present it. And it's strange that that particular initial set of sketches would finally lead to a restoration of Gandhi cycle and things like that, which you couldn't really have imagined or even foreseen, or could not have even kind of thought of if you were looking at this in terms of a linear, a linear professional, how would you say, disciplinary way of moving forward. Interestingly, the cycle restoration exercise had incredible parallels with the documentation process and questions that were being raised when we were at the Gandhi Ashram doing documentation of Gandhi's buildings. For example, if I take a mud plaster building, how should I draw it as a document for posterity? Because what dimension do I draw? How do I draw it so that there is precision? And what should the specifications be? Should there be damage to the building in a heritage conservation kind of way of thinking? And you realize that heritage conservation, all its tools are modern tools and don't necessarily subscribe to this way of working. Because I mean, either I have to do something really kind of super tech, which is, let's say, do a LiDAR scan of the whole building. But also then the question is that if I was doing a conservation, what should I restore the building to? Every year at Bapu Kutir, Lippan is done, plastering is done. Every year 2 mm the building changes in size. What would you consider the original? And that was the question that became really sharp and came into focus in the cycle restoration project. Is to, if we don't look at the absolute origin as the original that we have to restore the building to, then we actually free ourselves a great deal from a lot of the processes that bind us when we are thinking about these buildings. But it's a contentious issue, and that's the whole point of all these drawing exercises and so on, to open this up. I want to move on to a second drawing, or a second set of drawings, which are more to do with the practice. And this is a drawing of a swimming pool that we did in Alibag. And this was about, I think, 2010 or thereabouts. And this was to be a stone swimming pool. The interesting thing about the pool is that it's actually quite near the beach, and it's in a place where I grew up, and many of my cousins, it's actually for a cousin of mine. And we've been doing, over a period of the last 20 years, several renovation projects to houses in that area, some of them which are over 100 years old. And those buildings need to be retrofitted in an interesting way that many people now are looking at either those houses that were originally weekend or recreational use buildings are now looking at them as first homes. So the houses have to be upgraded or at least rethought in that way. Some of them are looking at it in the sense that it's becoming expensive to maintain properties there. So you let out these properties to Airbnb. Therefore, certain other kind of requirements you may not be able to have an open veranda. People from Bombay might want to close it, air condition it. All these are real issues that we deal with. So a project might well be only the enclosure of a balcony, but we've been doing this kind of little stuff along with the maintenance of these houses. In one such case, the idea was that the sea has become extremely dirty, and it's no longer possible to just get into your trunks and go into the sea anymore, or at least it's not advisable with the amount of oil and stuff that's in the sea now. Of course, in the lockdown, it's been fantastic. There's been dolphins back, there's been sharks that have been visible, turtles have been birthing, all kinds of things are coming back. Phosphorescence was visible after 20 years. Fireflies, these things were visible in the lockdown that were not earlier. But in 2008, the sea was polluted, and the idea was to do a saltwater swimming pool. And the idea came from my client, my cousin, who realized that by internet research that if you increase the salinity of the water beyond 17%, you don't need chlorine or ozone to keep away algae. So it's interesting that we did a whole kind of, this is a diagram of the way that the salt water would be actually taken from a bore well, which was drilled to brackish levels. And it was hilarious. We were with the borewell fellow and we are telling him, "Saab, wo bol raha hai ki saab wo 300 foot pe meetha pani aa jayega." So we are saying, "Hame meetha pani nahi chahiye." And he's looking at us like we are insane people, like who doesn't want sweet water? And this is literally like 50 meters away from the high tide line. And the minute he hits sweet water, we tell him go deeper to the brackish water, because you don't want to use that sweet water for this pool. Anyway, so we hit brackish water. And the whole idea was that when this is filled it's about 112,000 liter pool. So it's used to overflow and irrigate the coconut and casuarina plantation, which is around the pool. And then there's a whole set of cyclic processes that allow us to kind of keep replenishing the pool. As it happened, the reality of the pool is that these were all the various drawings that were made for its construction. But as it happened, we hit brackish water. The pool was used for 2 years in this manner. And then one monsoon, it rained so heavily and the water level was lower. And it filled up the entire pool. The salinity dropped below 17%. My cousins weren't in residence. Within a day, algae took over like you can't believe it. And then you just have to throw the whole system away. You just got to because you've got to clean that whole pool. And then when you realize that it's actually stone, you can't get rid of every bit of algae. So now, over the years, what these guys have done is they've been putting potassium and they've been putting in all various kinds of salt to keep this pool absolutely clean without having a kind of chlorine system. It hasn't always been successful, but the point is it's an experimental process to kind of keep going there. So these are the kind of bits and pieces, parts of projects which also got us thinking about how one is engaging with that context. This was another kind of project where, and I find it odd, please excuse my use of the word project, because these weren't even thought like that. These were really conversations that we were having with clients, friends, cousins, people who occupy these places. There was remuneration involved, which is the only thing that made it professional. This is the second situation. This is a little bit about 7 kilometers up the same coastline, down the same coastline, south. And there is a creek. You see the green netting over there in front of you. That's the property, and it keeps getting eroded away. For those who like trivia, this is the property right next to Shah Rukh Khan's house in Alibag. But the point is that this was it's a beautiful house on this property built by Pilu Modi, and one of my favorite houses belonged to a very close family friend who live in Paris. And the problem was that because they live in Paris, the panchayat knows that they are reasonably well off in dollar money. Now, because of that, the bribe required in order to build a stone embankment here was 5.5 lakhs. The cost of the stone embankment was 8 lakhs. So that put the the budget out of reach. And on top of that, being in France for a long time, they were completely abhorred by the idea of making this bribe. So they asked me if there was anything that we could do in order to stabilize this embankment. So I work with a couple of my cousins who are environmentalists and work in research in marine biology on the coast, and we started looking at what are the kind of what do you call them? The type of plants. The sorry, I've gone blank. It'll come back to me.
Mangroves.
Mangroves, thank you, Ustad. The kind of mangroves that we could grow here, but also the kind of local varieties that we could find in terms of stabilizing the entire age. And unfortunately, I realize I don't have recent photographs of it, but right now, this is about 6 years ago. It's completely green and held. And all we did was this very kind of chalu casuarina fence to keep it from the high tide and the netting. And allowed the plants over a couple of years to take hold and just bind the soil in that area. So that's just a project that you have to go back to again and again, and every year kind of nurture it with the caretakers of the property, explaining to them what to grow, what not to grow, etc., etc. And that's kind of taken hold. In the kind of time that we've been working in Alibag, we've also been making drawings, and another group of students, friends, worked with us on the drawing that you see above, which is a 7-meter long charcoal bromine kind of sketch, which goes and measures a 7-kilometer stretch of the beach on which we worked. The lower sketch shows you the kind of section that you get, and the reddish box is where we've done most of our work. But the whole point of making this drawing was to understand the context in which we've been working. So this is just to give you an idea of the nature of this drawing, of zooming in and all the things that we recorded, along again with people who are marine biologists, either sea anemones, the kind of cropping patterns that are there, but also the kind of soil, and you can see the cracking of the clay thing, the clay bed that you find in the creeks. And this was a kind of documentation that we did. There are several projects that have allowed us to continuously visit those areas in order to kind of map those relationships. And it is in that context, it is in that larger context that these projects have to be looked at. But it's not clear to me whether I consider the individual house to be a project, or this of building in that entire landscape bit by bit by bit by bit over a period of 15 years as the larger project. And I think that's because we made the drawing that we even have an imagination that all these projects together in some sense are part of one larger project of engaging with the context in a particular way. So this is actually a series of all the projects that we've done along that coastline. Yeah, this is one such project which in early 2000 was made. My mother, while I was still in high school, had commissioned a house, and because of the CRZ, it couldn't get built. So in 2000, with the help of a few people, a thatch house was made, temporary structure was made. And over the next 4 years, she lived in this, and she kept making small changes to the plan, because every year you'd have to dismantle it in the monsoon and then put it back together again after the monsoon in Diwali when she wanted to use it. And every year she'd make a little bit of change in the plan and the way it was kind of structured. And finally, after 5 years, when we did get permission to build, it was the final plan that got built. So I didn't design it. I simply interpreted that jhopdi, as we called it, into an architectural plan. And yet you wanted some of the sense of that space. And the way that we thought about screens and grills and all of that, and the way that filtered sunlight comes through those mattings that are made out of coconut leaves, is something that you are spatially kind of interested in. And that's what we were working on. But this was also a bits and pieces project. The first part of the planning was done in such a way that she could occupy it. There were 2 rooms which were made secure, and the whole house could collapse into those 2 rooms. There were no doors and windows. There were no grills. It was just one big veranda, and that's how it was designed. The doors and windows were put in next, the grills were put in. So this is actually 3 iterations after the house is used, so almost 10 years down the line. And the house was used. And it occurred to me that that's how houses got built in times. You never had the idea of a project is a modern concept. That you have enough capital to build a full house is a modern concept, because you can borrow money from a bank. Very, very few people would have had the one-time capital to build a house all at once. So you do think about the house incrementally. And if you think about this in terms of Ahmedabad, you can recognize that there's a spatiality which is continuous between a slum, a bazaar, the old city, to Jaisalmer. So the most beautiful, right down to what we abhor, based on the same spatial principles. But it's just that over time, people have been able to invest more and more back into their house, so that the slum becomes a really beautiful whole house. And if you start looking at those cycles and you allow those cycles, then our built environments will be very different from the way they are, because you haven't castigated it as a slum. The minute you've castigated and legally framed it as a slum, it has no way to grow out of its status as slum. And so this house actually made me realize that we've got to kind of think about how many cycles it takes, and how many increments does it take for a very basic jhopdi, which is pure shelter, to become something that is evolved and architectural maybe. And the question is whether we are, as a profession and as architects, willing to engage in those processes which are small, tukde tukde, but over a large period of time. So you are doing the same project work, but it's over a period of 10 years. I'm still doing it. We're just redoing parts of this house in terms of maintenance and upkeep. It's been close to 20 years, and the tiles we used very low quality tiles for that house because of the budget constraint. And they're seeping water. This time around, we have spent a lot more on the tiles, quality of tiles. So it's an upgrade process, but it doesn't look any different. But it took 2.5 months of work to do it. How do we account for these things? How do we engage with this as a profession, which is constantly upgrading the built environment? And these are the questions that occurred to me through these projects. And I think we are asking these questions now very formally when we talk about buildings like IIM, which are our one-time project way of thinking is saying, yaar, hame maintenance nahi karna hai, tod dete hain. That is the kind of level we've reached. We don't have the ability to think this through in a kind of, let's nurture our built environments. And this has huge ecological implications, right? And I think that a large amount of what the tukda way of thinking about it means that you don't kind of hold building processes as important only when you are given a project. You look at it, every engagement with buildings and the built fabric as part of an architectural process. This requires, in my opinion, a complete re-theorization of the way that we engage with our profession. So anyway, to continue, these are drawings that we made along the way. This is an addition that was made to the main house as a guest room, completely different kind of language, yet similar. It had to have vertical growth and a terrace in a place where you have sloping roofs. Interesting kind of architectural questions. This is the entire architecture of this is made with a 65 mm by 65 mm wooden column. So there's like many columns, a distribution. So these are all ideas that we are talking about from those early drawings that I showed you about density and forest-like spaces and so on and so forth. They're recurring. It's not that they go away, but those drawings are reminders of these partialities that we are interested in. And this is how the house is now. The last story with which I'll conclude is really this project that we did in Udaipur, which is a moss house. And interestingly, Sarosh and I were talking, or rather, we were communicating yesterday in the ways that we communicate these days online. And Sarosh was interviewed by a group of students at Cornell, and in that he talked about, in his interview, he talked about how deeply he was affected by the work that we did at that time. This is 2002, 3, 4. But it wasn't the architecture that affected him. It was the fact that there were women labor with children on site. And these were things that were in the background in our kind of, how would you say, in our ambition to be architects. You know, you were blinded. You didn't see it. You were taught not to see it. You were interested in that line, wo 13 degree skew mein kitna maza aa raha hai. And you know, you go completely blind to the fact that there are women who are underpaid, under represented labor on site in this particular case. And I was telling him that what really kind of devastates me every time I look at the Moss House photographs of construction is the violence that's implicit that we inflicted on the site. And this is the landscape. I mean, that was there, and we dynamited it. And the house in its completion looks like it's sitting there, but we know the violence that we kind of inflicted. And one might say that it's inevitable that building or any creative process will lead to some amount of destruction in the cyclic universe. I don't buy that anymore. This is just too violent, and Mr. Gandhi's ways of building have raised some serious questions about it. So also I'm saying that there is a certain modernity that we have to think about it that's coming through them. So these are just part of those dating photographs to tell you we were having great fun at the time, which is what's even more disturbing at this point in time, of how easily we could get into these formal exercises and not see. That's quite beautiful in my way of thinking about it. But I know how much dynamite went into allowing that building to sit into that rock, right? But there was also simultaneously this incredibly gentle process of craftsmanship that made those beautiful stone walls, this chiri ki chunai, that every little piece of stone is put into that mortar joint. And that's how the building sits, but it gives you no hint of that devastation that we created or we did. I could tell you 1,000 stories, and Sampi knows them more, perhaps better than I do, about making windows for this house, about the railway that takes you up to the house. All of these kind of interesting tukda stories, which are stories in themselves, which I could take you. The way that the pool is a thermal sink and keeps the living room 8 degrees cooler in summer, which is what we designed for, but we had no clue that it would keep it 8 degrees warmer in winter, which is fantastic because Mr. Moss could walk around in Udaipur winter in his shorts. But we didn't design, this was finding out. So yeah, these are just things that we did. But the point I want to come to, and the final kind of narrative, is this project that we did because of that house. And this was a client that came to us because he had storeroom and storeroom after full of old material from where he had simply bought it out in auctions and so on and so forth. And here we were supposed to use these old elements and kind of build. And we put together a team of craftsmen from that area. We had somebody by the name of Sivit Kumar, well known at the CEPT circles, who was stationed in Udaipur and really worked with these guys in order to build what we were proposing. And it's really interesting when you look at the plans of this. It's a Corbusian plan, but it's like I say, it's like Corbusian Ghungat. So the thing is, like, if you look, there's you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a columned space, which is like kind of piloti, and then you see the open terrace on the top. So there's this kind of diagonal relationships, not there in Mewar architecture traditionally. So you're working with these kind of spatial relationships with our modern, but you're using materials with which have this archaic old sense to it. And I have to tell you, I found this really difficult to work with because I was brought up in the exposed brick and concrete generation, and I found this really difficult. Ki iske saath kya kare? And It was a deschooling kind of process. But what was interesting is the kind of precision they got. And this is where we were really challenged by the orality of the craft tradition. And I have to tell you this story because it ties back to my starting point of drawing being a literate aspect of architecture. Nobody could understand our drawings. Not a single one of those master craftsmen who did work like this. This is just incredible craftsmanship. But they couldn't understand a drawing because it's written and they are oral people. They're not illiterate. It's not like they have any lack of knowledge system. They have much more about the craft that they deal with. And we reached there, and Civit would show them a drawing and then tell them that center line ka ye hai. Center line didn't mean anything to them. It's an abstract thing. It's something in the center of the material. It's not the material. And you start that fellow is looking at you with this blank look on his face. Ye center line kya hai? And on the other hand, he doesn't understand what that dimension means. And on one occasion, the changing point was that Civit spoke out an entire string of 16 dimensions. And the next week, everything was perfectly constructed. There was no pressure on him or no sense of inferiority that he had to adhere to the drawing. The drawing was taken out of the equation. Only what was spoken between Civit, one human, and another human was what was the reference point. So the drawing became more like a mimetic tool for us to remember what we are giving. Those guys would remember this is how this got built. So after that, we didn't make a single working drawing. We used only SketchUp and sketch dimensions in order to remember what we had said on site. If there were changes, we went back and forth in that way. And there was a reasonable amount of construction that one got done in this manner. Having tasted this craftsmanship, we decided through a whole series of other circumstances to start a workshop of our own and work with people who understood the craft of construction so that we didn't over push ourselves. We started with dry construction, so with wood first, and that was what it was. And this whole process of setting up a workshop and working and being able to see and engage with patterns of material and materiality led to a completely different sensibility in the way that we worked. It also changed the way we were drawing. We were drawing much less in the kind of what I say obsessive manner that we are in control and we will tell the craftsman what to do. Kaka, who some of you all will know very well, asked me, "Tame ao drawing. If you give a drawing like this in everything, with every single millimeter is specified, then what am I for? What am I supposed to do? Just like make what you tell me? No." Then and you realize that the drawing was disempowering the craftsman from his craft because it was telling him how to do something. And this really kind of disturbed me in the process of working with this workshop. And we did some fun stuff. There was no question. It was also this whole question as to what it consists of, what is enough for engaging and calling it something a work of design or architecture, and that's still up for question, and we can discuss it. But we did a huge amount of retail design and delivery, manufacture, etc., interiors which were modular and just repetitive because that's the way that we were working with corporate clients. But the whole kind of engagement with people was a very interesting one. And it goes back to the Udaipur story about literacy and drawing and how this was kind of how this was opened up. And I'd just end with when you are working with this bits and pieces way, and you open yourself to it, you realize it's everywhere. Whether you go to the Sunday market, you go to a festival, this kind of filigree of small bits is everywhere in our culture. And this is, I think, what we are losing as big capital slowly takes over. This is the politics of the space, that when the bigger the organization that controls the way that we make form, the fewer the people who are going to be empowered to make it. So there will be no question about making your own house in a few years, unless you get it done through an architect. Right, and you can see this little bits and pieces everywhere, and it takes me back to my intuition at the time of my undergraduate thesis of these spaces that are intrinsically humane because they include so many people in their making. And yeah, you try to understand it. And what I understand from this is that as you kind of break surfaces, as you kind of break building lines, building heights, coordination that all of us have found so important, making that Kadak building. The more you break it, which you see in all our traditional cities, the more the plan starts shifting, the more the section starts shifting, the jharokas come out. What really happens is that you free the corner from the line. And once the corner is free, and the line is always dividing space. It always says this is on one side is inside, the other side is outside. On one side is public, the other side is private. All of that kind. The corner is simultaneous. You have the concave corner and the convex corner, and I enjoy talking about this, and I've done it for years. That the convex corner is always aggressive. If I want to get aggressive with you, I will show you my knuckles or my elbows or get into a boxing posture. But if I want to kind of be intimate, I will hug. I will open my arms and make my body into a kind of concave space into which you can come. And that's the amazing thing, that the moment I make one, the other is already there. And so it's not exclusive. And the other incredible thing is when I occupy a corner, it automatically leads to other corners. I can never occupy a corner perfectly. Okay, I mean, I would have to be really, it would be a very really a difficult thing to do. And this is the magic of the Indian city. This is really the magic, that if I occupy a corner between two houses with a lari, there will be two smaller corners in which a galla can also set up, into which there will be two smaller corners into which some guy will send just two underwear. I don't know, I'm just saying. But the scale. So everybody there's a space for everybody, every scale in that city, because from the biggest to the largest, there's just like this kind of corner leading to corner, and the residue is very important. So, but we have been taught that this is beautiful architecture. So I'll leave it at that, because I think we all in a way struggle between these two things, about that crazy set of forms and this generous, manyness that surrounds us, but our desire to do this kind of stuff. Okay. So Ajaz, I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Can you please unshare your screen so that we can see you again? Wonderful. Because I honestly I don't feel like stopping you. We can go on with this for another hour, and we can easily, comfortably, just keep listening to you. It was so nice to see how your the excuses of drawing that you started with has led to so many diverse kinds of processes. Actually, you used the correct word when you say that these are not projects, but these are actually more like processes, and you go on building with every intervention, with every new process. Something additionally keeps on adding into that thing. There are too many things. I mean, I'm just trying to grapple the diverse things that you've actually brought into this one presentation. But I would actually like to invite Siddharth to initiate with his questions and the discussions. We can start with that. Yeah, Siddharth.
Yeah, so thank you, Patan, and thank you, Ustad, for it's overwhelming to say the least. And I'm not just trying to do tarif here. I don't know which strand to pick. There are so many things in here, but I think I will start with. Let's say there is some mischief over here in the way you have titled it, and let's look at that word, because I think it's important in terms of the language that we use. You've been referring to it as Tukde Tukde, which is, which is about bits and pieces, yes. But if you are actually looking at the connotation, it is about fragments of a whole. And I understand how you are kind of provoking, let's say, a discourse, or you're referring to something where right now we are stuck in an unfortunate political context where uh, everything gets discredited, right? And that's how a particular challenge or thought process is discredited by calling it tukde tukde as a threat to some homogeneity. Here, I would just start by with a caution that language, in that sense, can also be a trap, where you end up picking on those words, and then because the challenge from who is not so much about, it's not about defeat, it's about just keeping you busy in this language, in this jargon, right? But when I look at your entire process and I look at these decades of work, the words to me are tinka tinka or boond boond. I think that's a beautiful image where it's not about fragments, it's about picking these strands, it's about collecting drop, another drop, another drop, and you know the stream uh, that you're actually flowing in, or rather you are the flow. And I'll come back to this question of flow with another thing you talked about valorizing contemporary architecture, valorizing the now. And while I have some questions about that, but I do understand when you talk about your mother's house in Alibag, that clearly demonstrates what you're talking about, the nature of time, the idea of living and growing and making. And that architecture shouldn't really be a process. That architecture is not really about looking at things, and your drawings and the sketches are so much about spatial representation than the visual representation of things. You're not looking, when you're drawing that Gandhi ashram, whether it's outside the courtyard or you're drawing from the veranda or the arboreal forest or different kind of spaces, you're trying to imagine space and represent it rather than see, okay, how is this made, what is this, you're not really to borrow Himanshu Burte's term, he called something object focus. And if I remember from your conversation during our mid-sem, you talked about looking at the body. Even Chaya was talking about, if you look at the body, you're identifying the body, then you're outside. It's no more an experiential understanding or being with it. So it's throwing up so many challenges to the idea of practice itself, to the idea of education, to the idea of representation. And I hope there are a lot of students over here, and I hope they are thoroughly confused. I hope that's how it is panning out, because you start with drawings and then you subvert the whole process and you end with a project where there is no drawing. You talk about the empowerment. So I'm just going to go on. It's like, it's like going on in spins. There are so many things that you've created over here, generated over here, and I'm feeling it's unfair to say that, okay, there needs to be a question, because there's no question, honestly speaking. This can be a conversation which can go on for days.
So let me just Siddharth, let me just respond to that Tukde Tukde one, because I think it's a really important point you brought up.
Yeah.
Because partly I did look at it politically, but that was the fun mischief part of it. Okay, but I did look at it theoretically, in the sense that to have a fragment, you must have a whole that is broken. Okay, and in the suggestion I'm trying to make is that the architecture profession needs to be broken in the way that it is imagined. And this is a really I think it's the first time I've actually said it aloud. But what I mean to say is that the premise and the assumptions that are there need to be questioned, opened up, and put together in some other way. Because clearly, the way that they are working now disempower more people in our context. In another cultural context, it may be perfectly valid. But in our context, it disempowers more people than it empowers, and in ways which are extremely socially unjust. Okay, and I find it more and more difficult to engage with those professional frameworks because I'm just aware of this. And I think that when I say tukde tukde, what I mean is that the one presumption that I've said in many different ways, but I'm also clarifying, is that the idea of that an architect makes a building or an architect makes a project needs to be questioned. Okay, an architect, if I look at, let's say, the way Eisenman looks at it, uh, an architect simply thinks about the built environment. The architect is an intellectual, and both he and Mark Wigley are very clear on that. Others may disagree. Somebody like Peter Zumthor will definitely disagree. Somebody like Juhani Palasma will probably think that that is why we need to break architecture, because we are intellectuals, and that a more humane approach is required, sensibility is required. The question is that we need to open this up, and it might need to be done differently in a European context, and it might need to be done differently in our context, culturally, and the way we are. So, I mean, my point is, I also think that there's a power of the fragment, which is something that, once you have broken things down into their constituents, there is an immense power of putting them together in new ways. Which is normally that energy, when it is realized socially and culturally, leads to movements, right? It is what leads, when you realize again that there is a new way that we can organize ourselves, that's what leads to a movement. And I think that one has to recognize that. So I'm just saying that in that context, I'm less than the powers that be. Of course, there was a play on words there, not going to, but I think that I wouldn't have used it if they didn't have a context in architecture.
I appreciate that, and also my reference to Boond Boond and Tinka Tinka is it's not a romantic reference in that sense. No. It's a very embodied. It's essentially about making something, and you are really not under pressure. If I look at that 7 kilometers of stretch of seashore in Alibag, you didn't start off with the thing that ye jahan tak tumhari nazar phailti hai sara hamara ilaka hai, right? That's not the idea. You are growing and you're kind of appropriating and you're learning and you're making things, and that is where it's becoming slightly difficult for me to say that okay, there is a whole and then there is a fragment, because you said I've broken it down. I'm just taking these parts and making it my own, right? And there is definitely a challenge to the so-called mainstream practice of architecture, conventional practice of architecture, even the fact that an architect is going to design your building, which has come into severe scrutiny and challenge right now, even legally, right? So we are facing a crisis right now, and it could be a good situation to be in, because what really is perpetuating this mainstream idea of what an architect should be or what kind of a service do they provide? Because there are a lot of these practices which may not be as prolific as yours in terms of how they engage with the context and the kind of what you call unsustainable engagements that you get into, whether it's drawings or whatever. But I guess everybody has that sense of going off track. So in a way, there is a question about this: what is perpetuating this whole idea of what architecture should be, can be. Your serious challenge to you shouldn't be looking at buildings, you should be feeling and perceiving buildings like Palasma.
Siddharth, I would not necessarily go that way. In the sense, my way of thinking is a little bit different. It's not, in the sense, I'd like to, let me kind of articulate it. I'm not dismissing the role of the architect as it is framed right now completely. For example, I'm saying that there is an appropriate scale of operation for which it is valid. Okay, so for example, if I was to build an airport, I'd be an idiot to suggest that it should be built in the manner that I'm suggesting here, with the kind of intimacy that I'm talking about, with the time of time scales I'm talking about, and not possible. And it would be inappropriate on so many levels. So at at some scale, what I'm saying is that different organizational principles of practice apply to different types of buildings. And I'm interested in the scale that has to do with houses and housing. Okay, and you could extend that to institutions of a certain scale. Okay, and that's the scale I'm interested in. What I'm concerned about is that even those scales are being appropriated by the larger scale of operation, or the methods of the larger scale of operation, uh, which are being applied to a scale that requires a different kind of intimacy. Okay, certainly I don't expect highways to be designed in this way, or I don't expect hospitals of a certain scale. But the fact that this is becoming a hegemonic, one could say even a fascist way of thinking, that only the big, the powerful, and the speedy are valid, is something that I find objectionable, actually. So I'm saying that we must have metros in our cities. I think that is something that we must think about, because our cities are now of a scale where certain large systems have to be conceived. Okay, and their modes of production will be different from those of other scales of institutionalization. But to say that everything should be the same is what I'm questioning, and I'm wondering whether we can keep some of the other modalities of making and production alive. That's the question.
Yeah, but if you look at how the past year has gone, isn't the scale of the city itself under question? Whether we really need a metro in the city, isn't that itself under question?
Well, I don't know. I think how would you? I think it's a question of how you frame that. From what are you questioning about the metro? For example, are you questioning that I do not need to travel those distances? I would say that that's an extremely provincial way of looking at a city. That it's a hyper locality. You can't, unless you allow for movements of a certain scale, you can't have the cosmopolitan. The fact that somebody like me leaves Bombay and comes to Ahmedabad assumes that certain movements are possible, that allows a person from a different place to coexist with other people. Now, unless if I believe in a cosmopolitan society, then those movements are imperative. They're very important, because otherwise I become a hyper local. What is the word? Provincial, yes, but there's another word that I'm losing. But I become this insular. It's a form of ghettoization in a way. So I mean, yeah.
Yeah, but I'll still persist with the question, because this cosmopolitanization of city of whatever scale, does it really need a metro? Because I'm imagining of this guy, let's say if I'm in Delhi and there is somebody who's working for me, who's coming from, let's say, Bahadurgarh or some place, he travels 2 hours in a way. I've had students who've traveled 2 hours one way. They're spending 4 hours in the metro and auto or whatever they're doing. And I'm wondering, what is it that is left to them as their own time, as their time of intimacy with somebody, with their family, or what are they doing? They go home, sleep, eat, and then they travel, they come and work and study, and then they go back. What exactly is happening? And I'm wondering, what of this cosmopolitanization are they really experiencing? And that is why I'm encouraged by the question that you are asking about growth, about not looking at everything. Yes, of course, I'm saying the airport cannot be built, that we shouldn't have airport. I'm not saying all that. But I'm saying that, yeah, there needs to be some sense of a scale. I mean, even today, there are 3 bubbles which are in the rural hinterlands. And whatever the state decided to do, it forced migrant laborers to go back into those. And a lot of people ended up getting infected, not having livelihood, having to come back. So there is this forced migration which is happening, and this could lead us into a completely different area. But I'm just wondering, can we take this idea that you're talking about of growth, of incremental architecture or incremental building further and challenge the assumption that metros are necessary? Right? Or how many airports do you need? I mean, something of that kind, because what is really driving, and you've made your point very clear, homogenizing all practices, everything that you're trying to do, not just architecture or building, but it's taking over everything. And again, I don't want to get trapped in what I had started off by saying, that let's not get trapped in this language or whatever. But I'm saying, what are the ways in which what you have presented can really be taken up, can be appropriated without really worrying, is it sustainable? Will I survive with this? Right?
So, I mean, there are two levels at which I'm looking at it. One is I'm looking at it as a mode of practice. Okay, if for me it has to become a mode of practice, then the mode of engagement by a client, a prospective client. Let's take a person X who has a small house, who wants to get it renovated. In fact, somebody from Isanpur in Ahmedabad just approached me and then backed out because they felt, this is going to be expensive. And actually, it would not be. Actually, it would not be. But the point is that there is a sense that, how do I take a loan for such a small building project? What are the cycles of, what are the economic cycles that allow me to engage with this person who's calling himself an architect, who, let's say in this case, is a very well-meaningful person who wants to do small bits and pieces practice. Okay, and let's say that what would be the kind of financial framework by which that person would be able to avail of my services? And my services may not necessarily be expensive, but the material, we're talking about something in the order of 2 lakh rupees. Okay, let's say that each cycle is between 2 and 7 lakh rupees. If we are looking at those kind of cycles, do I get home loans? Right now in the old city of Ahmedabad, they can't get a loan for renovation, okay, from a bank for heritage. This is a very strange kind of thing that banks have not. So I'm saying that there'll be a whole financial dimension to this, apart from the cultural and the political dimension that will enable this. And I think we are going to have to work with that if we really kind of think this is valuable. And partly my foray into the policy side of things with NIUA has been to see if there is a potential for this, and within the frameworks of heritage or others that may be possible. I mean, the old city, to engage with the old city in any way, to see that it is, what is its future potential is of interest to me. It has been. The other part of it is that, from the time all of us who were interested in the old city always looked at this, the romantics. All of that. And there is a reality that one has to deal with and break it down in order, if one is going to engage with those contexts. And it has to do with politics, finance, all of that kind of stuff.
But there was a very interesting period between 96 to 2004, I think 2005, when the Ahmedabad Heritage Cell was working. Yes. And they had come up with a wonderful program where there were loans available for renovating houses, and they did some lovely work.
Yes.
And so it's not that it is not possible.
It's not possible.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the question is how, like you said, you need the loan now, but you also need a loan 4 years down the line when you do the next cycle of increment. Yeah. So you need the security that the loan will be there. There's no point doing it now, and then the loan system falls apart 5 years from now. So the whole thing about it is, you need, one of the reasons why it's successful in certain kind of economies is because those economies are stable. Right now, in those stable economies, things like home loans and interest rates are reasonably stable, which allow you to say that 5 years from now, those systems will still be in place. Okay, in our context, maybe we will get there, but we aren't thinking in those lines. That's all I'm saying, and that needs to be as much part of our thinking in the way that we think, in the way that we are engaging with our urbanity. So it's not only what I'm saying is also the realization. It's not about going to office and making the next 5 drawings. That, of course, it is there to keep the juices going, but it also means broadening one's spectrum of how would you say, of engagement that I would not have believed 3 years ago that I would be talking finance with you. That's what I mean. I didn't think that I had the conceptual framework to fit it in with my other interests.
Now, you talk about literacy and oral tradition and the inherent empowerment or disempowerment that it offers. You've been teaching for a very long time. How could this be kind of brought into the pedagogy?
Well, it's a really interesting. I think the most important part of it is our realization has been that there are multiple knowledge systems that are there in our context, if I can just broadly call it that. Of course, they're specific. They're so specific to where we are. If I'm in Ahmedabad and I'm in Trichy, those systems change dramatically. But what I'm saying that in an area of, let's say, a school, since you're raising the question pedagogically, that within the context of a school, there are certain knowledge bases available. To look at a course that is able to recognize these, document them in the way that is possible in order that they may be inculcated by students, and then look at projects which involve that inculcation in order to demonstrate an understanding. I think those are ways in which one can look at it. I mean, I'm not saying that the whole course should be about that, but if you were to, say that a few courses have this kind of structure, and you're saying that it's not right now, my sense is that the professional course is basically saying that the professional knows best. And it says that everything out there is to be told what is best. There is no kind of receiving from that context any kind of knowledge system. Okay, there's no kind of process within the school or the academic institution that digests what comes in from outside. So I mean, I think those are the kind of things that I think would be useful to kind of look at. Just making people sensitive to the fact that these systems exist. Then how you record them, how you document them, how you abstract them, what kind of fancy presentations we make in order to share them. That's all part of the fun. And I think those should be free. They should. I mean, if you want to use parametric softwares to talk about craftsmanship, of course, sure, go ahead. But recognize the craftsmanship first. Find ways in which the knowledge of the craftsman can, impact your algorithm. That kind of thing. Make those kind of platforms where these engagements take place. So I think there's a lot that can be done. The question is whether we recognize those sensibilities and knowledge systems in the first place.
So in a way, what you're saying is that pedagogy, whether it's professional or it's at the primary, secondary, tertiary level, it's still looking at whitewashing the context rather than existing in an intelligent relationship that you are sharing, you are exchanging, you are learning from it.
Yeah, I would say that the relationship aspect of it is getting weaker. That is certainly what I would say. I'd say it's becoming more of that the professional will impose him or herself on all that they do, rather than it being a relational engagement that evolves. And maybe in certain cases that, as we discuss, in certain cases there's space and time for that. In other cases there isn't. But I think it's a question of how you find which one is appropriate. There's a very interesting philosophical kind of rumination, which looks at this idea of speed and bias. The thing is that biases are important, okay, and in that sense, and the reason I'm relating this to the fact that we are talking about whitewashing, and we are saying that there is a certain kind of academic and professional bias, okay, and the fact that you need a human engagement in order for you to be put that bias in question. So I need to have a human engagement with a crafts person in order to put my drawing bias in question. I could not have done that sitting intellectually in a classroom or in the studio. In fact, I've realized that the studio is a beautiful insulator from having those engagements and allows you to make these beautiful drawings which have nothing to do with anything. And that's why I made the clarification in the beginning that the drawing always and must relate back to a reality. and not be a set of abstract explorations in itself, which are fine. I mean, I think I value somebody like Eisenman's work, but it's not necessary. I find it difficult to find value for that in our context. Uh, in a mechanical production system, I think it has its place. But coming back to this, that so my bias requires questioning, for which it requires time. But if I have to react and put up a project in where I have to give working drawings in 15 days, all my biases better be really well honed so that I can take the best decisions in order that I can deliver that project in 15 days. So the bias is something that is also part of what I am preparing myself with. That all my biases are really sharp and crisp, and I can take decisions when I'm called on to, and therefore I can work very quickly and very fast. But I must then retract back and allow those biases to be put into question again in order that those biases get sharper or not. The problem is that everybody is working at breakneck speed, which only valorizes the bias. Okay, and doesn't give you the time to take a step back and say, what the hell is what is the meaning of these biases that I'm constantly responding to in a very fast project. So I mean, I'm just saying that all of these things are at play when we are talking about you know the kind of whitewashing, and we're talking about speeds, and we're talking about homogenization. All of this is at play.
Yeah, so I would like to kind of stop here. And if there are any questions, I mean, the only thing that I would kind of hope for now, particularly looking at your work, and there are quite a few people I've been looking at, admiring their work, that there is some scope. I don't know what you have on this, that you study for 3 years and then you decide whether you want to pursue it further, or you go into all the innumerable possibilities still remaining in architecture. You know, so I wonder what you have to say about that, and we can probably, if there are other questions coming up.
When you say you study for 3 years, as in your first 3 years, and then you you do 2 years of bhatak, and then you come back and you figure out whether you want to. I would strongly recommend that. I would say, why just 2 years? Do it your whole life. It's what I've been interested in.
Keep wandering, I think.
Keep wandering, keep being a vagabond. You know, as long as you can figure out how to make it work, I think that's the important thing. And I think anybody who thinks that this comes without failure is bullshitting themselves. I think that if you think that there haven't times when we've been under incredible financial stress, that would be completely false. If you think that you know, this could be done you know, without support from family and so on, the toll has been incredible. So I would say, I mean, take it with what you can push. And I would say that there's going to be failure with it, as much as there's going to be great fun and success from time to time. And of course, I'll present only the successes. So we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, quite. I can quite relate with that. I think Riyaz what you said, because inevitably in our wanderings, the people who are surrounded by us, our families, have invariably, been कि यार ये क्या कर रहा है? I mean, what the hell is in life up to? This last conversation that you were having between this need to break things down, to have smaller approaches, incrementality, density, and on the other hand, we talked about the need for the metro or some kind of a different way of approaching. And there's one constant quote from Aldo Van Eyck that has just become very familiar with me over the past couple of years, and I always keep going back to that, and it's coming to my mind right now, and he puts it very nicely. I not remember the exact word, but it goes something like this: that when we look at the birds in flight, we admire the beauty, and compared to that, when I look at something like an African village, there's a different kind of a beauty, a sense of aesthetics involved in it. Architecture needs both. If it would fail if it ignores one or the other. And in many ways, uh, like in my personal journey, like what I've been doing involved currently in CEPT, I've actually been doing both things parallelly, and at many times I find very contradicting. I mean, one studio that I've been doing, which is on the birds side, and the other kind of a studio which is currently which I'm doing is pretty much similar to the Tukde Tukde, or if I may just call it that way, if you don't mind. And these contradictory things have been parallelly going on for the last 3 years. I think on almost every alternate studio that I've been offering has one on this side, on the other side, and many times I've wondered as to but I do find the need for both, and to exist. I mean, that is, I'm talking about more about my personal journey, and based on the discussion that you guys are talking about, I find these contradictory paths existing. So it was very interesting to listen to both of you. Now, of course, you could go on debating as to to what extent one takes over the other, and those discussions can go on, and there are some interesting outcomes have occurred. My question is, which is related to that also, you use the words density in your presentation. You also started with some of the sketches that you were showing, and in that sense you could understand that you're trying to capture that density through various mediums, through the sketches while you are sketching the forest, to while you are mapping the bazaars, you are trying to get that sense of the density. Okay. And when I compare that with this bits and pieces or tukde tukde approach or they talked about, are these two things related? Are the one and the same thing? How do you look at it? Is the question that I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, yes. For me, they're completely related. I don't know if I'll be able to articulate the relationship clearly, but let me try. So, the discussions about density and weight, which actually were extremely intense kind of discussions that we had in the early part of our practice. Actually, we still do, only that at that time there were four of us, and there was more sustained conversation about it. But anyway, to say that we were looking at it completely formally. Okay, in the sense that we were looking at material form, we were looking at the organization of form that allowed you to talk about density and what it meant. Okay, and in that, what we were lamenting perhaps was one of the losses, except amongst the very, very accomplished architects of the modern time, Aalto, Cobb, Wright, Mies, even Mies, who were able to demonstrate with modern materials a certain density and weight. But if you looked at the general modern architecture, there was this kind of giving way to transparency and lightness. And the entire metaphysics of it, where transparency is looked at as honest and so forth. And there's a certain kind of moral speak that goes with that transparency. So on one hand, we were responding very directly to experiences that we were having architecturally, where density and weight meant something to us. And we were trying to say, how do you talk about this in the same framework as modern architecture, which has valorized as Rowe and Slutsky do transparency and so on and so forth. So that was one part of it. And Gandhi there is a really important kind of pivot in the thinking. And my first essay, which is called Frugality, the search for an intimate modern. Okay, in that, the idea that there is a difference between being frugal and being minimal was what I tried to open up in the conversation. And in the minimal means that you use material, but you use it less. Frugality asks from ground zero whether you should use material at all. And these are two fundamentally different approaches to form making. Okay, and whereas frugality will therefore assume that the world is full and that you will carve out space. okay, which is very, very, I mean, very beautifully talked about in Vedic and Sanskrit studies, as to that there is this sense of the plenum, and you carve out that the world is carved out by the removal or the reorganization of material. Okay, so these are the kind of things that we were talking about, and therefore it can be done only incrementally. Okay, because it's full, it's there, it's only a reorganizing of it, and in that sense I found that we were able to, like, step by step, so yeah, the first, those drawings were about 6 or 7 years before the Gandhi essay exercise, and that's about 6 years or 7 years before the next kind of understanding of this incrementality. So you're finding words for what you're already experiencing after drawing for a substantial amount of time, and you're being able to kind of put together the relationship between things. So if I was to say that the incremental is always asking, how much should I do? And in that sense it's tied up through this idea of frugality. The incremental is tied up to the idea of density and so on and so forth, and it makes this whole kind of domain of working very different from the one that modernity and minimal uses. So for example, if I look at the Gandhi ashrams, both of them, the veranda is continuous with the space under the trees, or no? They are both shaded, they are both devices of shading, and the way that those the plantations are done so carefully in both ashrams, one gets a sense that there is a thought behind what is the space outside the building, right? Which is not the case even in Korea's building. Even the outside space within the building is separate from the building. It is other than inside. And this is what it ties up with, when you start looking at that line I told you between inside and outside, and how do you keep breaking it?
Plinth is also floating in front.
Yes, the plinth is also floating. So, I mean, all those gestures are important to the way that we conceive building. So, yeah, so I guess the question has been whether we can find a vocabulary to talk about it. Because if you want to be able to design, you have to be able to think about it. And for that, you need a vocabulary to talk to yourself about what it is you're designing. And in some sense, we have been struggling with that vocabulary to kind of figure it out.
Yeah, I would like to include one question here that has come from our friend Mahruf, and it is related to the incremental building processes. Particularly, I think the house that you showed us, how it has been, slowly, incrementally, it has evolved over a period of time. So the question that he's asking, that kind of like, in the process of reusing and incrementally building and modifying a house or a building, my understanding is that the materials are very important, what are used. And so the masonry is one such material that is most suited for that. It's because its inherent nature, it's modular, and it allows you to incrementally go on adding. So what happens when, but the RCC elements uh, inherently are short of this quality, because of the steel and other issues, the corrosion, etc., and allied things. And most modern buildings are, are built with these materials and these systems. So how can I reuse, remodel this incremental approach? Can be applied with these kind of newer materials, newer technologies also?
So yeah, that's actually that's incredible, because Maruf, that's the question we've been grappling with right now. And again, like just in the narrative of this Tukde Tukde, the last 3 months with Sarosh and Shubhra, we've been really working on kind of conceptualizing what you do with a building like IIM's dormitories when they want to break it, because in some ways it is directly related to what Maruf is asking. Concrete, what do we do? So there are two things that I think of. One is, I think that certainly one must think about that, and one must think about very carefully where one uses concrete and what is its lifespan. But I think that there are cultural things which are linked to this. One of them is that at the time that concrete became a prominent material in India, there was a notion that there are these set of materials, let's say concrete, brick, steel, which are even steel was not considered that, but concrete and brick is considered pakka, and that pakka buildings don't require maintenance. Okay, now 50 years ago, that was the sense you had of concrete and brick, that there is something inert about concrete, and therefore it will not react with the atmosphere, it will not react with water, it does not have the leakage problems of mud, or that I have to do lipan every Diwali. वो सब निकल गया. This is maintenance free. Now that idea of pakka, so you can, and this is prevalent even as recently as the 2001 earthquake, where if you asked somebody in Bhuj if they wanted to rebuild a bunga, they would say no, we want a pakka house, and it had an aspirational sense in that much time, right? So there was a sense that these materials are absolutely maintenance free; they will not. Now scientifically, now in the last century, we know that concrete has a lifespan. Okay, and that it will require certain cycles of maintenance. Okay, already there's a cottage industry of concrete manufacture and repair, right? So today, if you got retrofitting to be done to a slab, you can get a guy to come and do a polymer plaster and do a chemical coat to your reinforcement quite easily, or even do a retrofit to the slab. It's not difficult, right? Unless it's a bridge or something, that's a different. But if you're talking at the level of a domestic architecture, then certainly it's possible to do a retrofit. It's even possible to put a steel girder and, kind of strengthen it. So there are ways. Now, the question is whether you're looking at that steel girder as a compromise or a design opportunity. And that's the process I am talking about. That the minute you get a restoration project, okay, or you get even a repair project, and yes, and the guy is saying only that my steel is rusting, whether there's an architecture to it, whether you then start saying that the way that I put that steel beam and column is going to be crafted absolutely beautifully, right? And that's when it starts becoming an architecture project. Whether you're putting two beams and a strut, I don't care, but that's the place of engagement. Okay, and I think that then the way that one, if you start thinking in that manner, then you start looking at potentials. What can I do with that strut and that column and that steel? So I do. I mean, my sense is that that is the way that I would say that the potentials are going to emerge now that concrete buildings in India have lived their cycle. Okay, and we are at that stage where they are being asked, or we are being asked, are you going to maintain them? Are you going to do a retrofit, or are you going to just break them as the IIM guys are suggesting? Or are we going to find beautiful creative ways in which this material is going to continue being there? Because it seems, I mean, if I take an example like IIM, it seems ludicrous that you would break all of that, and that embodied energy of the brick and the concrete is just going to be put to waste. It just seems completely bizarre. Whether it is about Khan or not, to me is secondary. Just the fact that you use that material and you're going to break it and destroy it and put it in a landfill seems to me ridiculous. So, I mean, to respond to Maru's question, I think we're going to have to find ways. This is a problem that our generation of architects is confronted with, that buildings made in concrete are reaching their age, okay, where they require their first cycle of maintenance. Perhaps it will also make us think about what should we have done 20 years ago that we wouldn't be in this place with concrete structures. So all of these questions are very, very interesting to me as to how it will change the way we practice. It seems really interesting that in his letter, the director of IIM said that IIM's concrete has had maintenance issues for the last 20 years. Okay. And we know that from the time that Professor Raje was the architect, there were issues with Khan's concrete. And yet you will build your entire new campus in concrete. That seems to me an incredible way to think about this problem. And 60 years from now, what will be the kind of issues that concrete faces will be interesting, and there will be a whole set of architects who will be required to deal with it. And this perpetuates the professional framework that I was talking about. where actually there will be some Bijal Shah who will come with a polymer paint and put the chemical on the bar. That is the guy who is actually sorting out the problem. So anyway, that's just to bring it back to that. I don't know if I've completely answered Maruf's question, but I think that there's potential there.
Yeah, I think all good things come to an end. It just don't feel like stopping you, Riaz. While you were presenting, I felt like you should have just continued the presenting, and this talk also has been very nice. It's just like being with you at the canteen and talking and chatting. But
what I suggest is that you have a reflective jagran. We start off post dinner and then just go on.
That's a good idea. Maybe we can have these reflective jagran sessions, and we could organize them on some day. But fantastic. I mean, Riyaz, it was full of energy, and I don't know how should I conclude this, but thank you so much, Riyaz. Thank you so much for coming here, for giving your time, making this nice, fantastic, sharing your journey, and I hope that we can continue this discussion some other time in some other space or maybe here. And so thank you so much, Riyaz. Let me start with you. Thank you for giving your valuable time.
Yes, wonderful time. And as always, the conversation and the discussion has been great. Look forward to more.
Sure.
Thank
And
you.
yes, Sidhu, thank you so much for coming to this discussion, participating, and raising some really good, insightful questions. It has been a wonderful session watching you guys talk to each other. And so I would like to conclude here on this note that we would like to continue this reflections series more and more with more architects, more designers coming on board, and in very soon we will come up with another interview in this series. Also, just on a concluding note, please don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel if you think that we are doing great. And the next interview I think we are doing with architect Manish Jangid from Ahmedabad Studio Praxis is going to talk about his mode of practice and how he has evolved various streams that he has been working with. So till then, please bid me goodbye. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining with us. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.